I feel like the 94 calls to action was a really good starting point. I feel like the development, the time and energy that went into the development of them and to really create the start of a system of change in regards to truth and reconciliation, it was a great starting point and kind of an opportunity for government, agency, non-Indigenous, colonial systems to gain a better understanding, a better opportunity to be able to look at what reconciliation truly means. And it was a good documented starting point for them to really have the answers almost, right? Instead of go out and what is truth and reconciliation? Here's the answers. This is what truth and reconciliation is. But there's an action piece of it around recognizing, I think, and accepting what the truth is behind it all. And then these are some good action pieces that we need commitment. Without the formal true understanding piece of it, and then the I guess the acceptance and honoring of the truth behind it all, how does it become actionable? And I feel like that's where we've been at for the last few years, is accountability and transparency on behalf of implementation, right? The 94 calls of action were developed and derived with the intent that these things would be done. And in my opinion, through the work with Ktunaxa First Nation and being an Ktunaxa woman, an Indigenous First Nations woman, I don't think there's been a lot of action in regards to implementation into true recognition, understanding, and activity around it, which leads to reconciliation, right? So I think that when the discovery of the unmarked graves and finding of the remains of all the First Nations people that didn't make it home from residential school, that was a piece of the history's truth of Canada that had to come to light. But when it's brought to light, there's such an integral piece of honoring, respecting, and putting into action of what you, just with that alone, there's so many actions within the 94 calls to action that should have come to fruition to help with the healing, help with honoring those peoples and their nations. You know what I'm saying? That it's the responsibility of everybody. It's not just the responsibility of First Nations to bring those actions to light, to surface, to reality. There needs to be intent. And I think that we're still at a point in time where there's still a lot of that intentional action not being done.
Well, I think that they probably could if more people were aware. You know, I think that one of the issues about this whole thing, I mean, they've been around for quite some time, but really it's not part of everyday life, you know. And I think that in order for us really to be making any kind of progress around paving the path to reconciliation, that it needs to be far more reaching, and we need to find ways to make it more accessible to every person. Because certainly, folks in, organizations and government, et cetera, they're all aware of that. But I would suggest that if you were to do an interview the person on the street, that you're not going to get a whole lot of knowledge, and that to me is unfortunate.
Do you have any, I mean, how would you go about making that more, I guess, visible?
Well, I think part of it is just through conversation, and then obviously having the opportunity to present to various groups. And I think, you know, certainly a lot of that is happening, but it's still, I don't think it sort of extends beyond, you know, beyond boundaries of organizations or, you know, structured opportunities to do that. And but I, you know, do want to commend folks. You know, there are certain groups that are, you know, that are making efforts, and I think that that's extremely important. But at the same time, you know, we got to think about how do we get the messaging out in a way that is non-threatening and, you know, is friendly and accessible, and making it part of our conversation. I certainly think that there's some of the calls to action, you know, provide that opportunity to do that, and we need to take more advantage of those that, you know, that raise the sort of the information, that raise the, you know, that raise people's consciousness in general, you know, and for people to recognize this isn't about government doing something. This isn't about somebody else doing something. It's about each and every one of us doing something.
I think, first of all, I want to give acknowledgement to all of the people who made contributions towards the development of those recommendations. I know that there were many survivors who had to retell their stories and go through that experience. And I think some of them did it because they wanted to begin healing, and contributing towards the development of this report was a way of doing that. So I have huge respect for everyone who did that. In terms of what is happening on the ground as a result of these recommendations, in my capacity as Nisukan and former political executive of the First Nations Summit and member of the BC First Nations Leadership Council, I don't really see a lot of uptake on behalf of the federal or provincial governments in terms of implementing these recommendations.
What do you think the issue is there? Why do you feel there hasn't been a lot of uptake?
Well, there's 94 calls to action, and since its inception, there's between 13 to 14 recommendations that are either being implemented, or that have been implemented or in the process of being implemented. The remainder of those recommendations are just sitting there, and there seems to be some kind of a stall in terms of having that level of willingness and commitment to work towards implementing those other remaining recommendations. I think that the federal government is not thinking about reconciliation the way that it had initially begun when it became the in thing to talk about reconciliation. We've noticed that with the current Prime Minister, Carney, that his focus now is around economic development, as well as Premier Eby, as a result of the fast tracking of those bills, Bill 5 federally and 1415 provincially. And they created those bills without any real meaningful engagement or consultation with First Nations in the country for Bill 5 and in the province for 1415. And they are the ones who endorsed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and went so far as developing legislation to support that, to support the implementation of the United Nations Declaration. And it speaks specifically to aligning their laws with the standards set out in the United Nations Declaration, and doing that in conjunction and partnership with First Nations. And so they themselves haven't even met that standard that they set out for themselves, which is set out in the laws that they created. So we're seeing them starting to stray away from those commitments of having strong partnerships with First Nations across the country and here in British Columbia.
What do you think needs to be done to correct that?
I think they become quite complacent, really. I think that they figured that they threw a few $1 million out to First Nations over the last few years, and now I believe that they think that they've done enough, and now it's time to focus on something else. I think it has a lot to do with outside pressures as well. I know that Premier Eby, when he was campaigning, he spoke a lot about needing to sit or taking information from the kitchen table discussions that he was having, and really didn't speak much to anything related to reconciliation. And so that was the first flag that we saw when he wasn't really referencing reconciliation efforts at all, but mainly speaking about how he needs to really focus on the general population. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can do both. I think you have a responsibility to do both. It's not a contest between Indigenous peoples or First Nations peoples and non-Indigenous peoples in this province or in this country. It's about reconciliation was meant to be about how do we come together and reconcile those differences that we have amongst ourselves and work towards building a stronger, safer place for all of us in this province. But they seem to think that it's easier on their part to be able to do a divide and conquer tactic, and that's what I'm seeing.
I think the progress is really slow. I think that there could have been a lot more action induced at the forefront, which shows commitment, right? So many of the actions, it requires accountability and it requires collaboration to help those come to fruition and help those to be something that is actionable. And that hasn't happened. That hasn't happened to its true sense. I think that at a very superficial level, it has in areas where it's comfortable or where it's fitting for colonial systems or government practices or organizations. And then there's some that is very intentional and rigorous to the true intent of what the action is, be it just a Canadian citizen or a standalone organization where, again, they've allowed themselves to gain a better understanding of who we are, where we came from, and all the atrocities we've had to live through. We're still here. And so they truly believe the truth, but also commit themselves to be a part of change, to create a system of change that isn't a continuation of those practices. So as a First Nations leader, I feel that there's still a lot of systems in place that are still assimilating. There's still a continuity of what happened to us in the past. Therefore, to its true intent of why they were developed, when they were developed, and how they were to be implemented, not a lot of true effort, in my opinion, has been put towards that, where we want to be a part of the positive change, the opportunity for healing, and healing as a people's, like healing as our own, but also healing as a collective. Because sometimes the truth hurts, sometimes the truth is ugly, sometimes the truth is damaging, but we have to accept it in order to move forward. And I think every First Nation, no matter where you are, wants the opportunity to move forward in a good way. But the only way that good way can happen is through true collaboration and true understanding and respect, which means honor the truth, and we'll all pave a path forward that is derived from who we are in a real cultural manner. And that's reconciliation, because it also provides an opportunity for relationship that is based on accountability, transparency, and trust. And then we move forward as a collective.
Well, I think that as I just said, that there's more work to be done, and that we need to find ways of making sure that more folks are aware of it. And I just don't think that there's a general awareness. There's certainly specific pockets of awareness, through the education system, through organizations that feel that that's important. But we haven't made it a part of our everyday conversation. And as we're leading into the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, that hopefully that we can do things that people understand that that's not just a day off. It's not just, it's just not a thing that you don't have to go to do whatever it is that you do, that there's a reason for it, and that you need to understand that reasoning for it. And then also recognize that in order for it to move forward, that it means talking about some uncomfortable truths, and that's really the challenge that we have, because a lot of times people don't want to go there. They don't want to have to face the fact that a lot of the things that they're, that they have in their lives today are as a result of something that happened, some very wrong things that happened in the past. And, to be able to acknowledge and recognize that it's very difficult. I mean, human nature being what it is, they're not, human beings don't want to make things hard. We want things to be easy. We want things to be comfortable. We don't like to be in uncomfortable situations. So we avoid those kinds of things. And we have a tendency just to be really very surface, very small in terms of what our interactions are. People will want to, don't want to talk about, some of the things that are foundational to the reason that we even needed a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's some reason for it, and it just didn't happen because somebody came up with a good idea, and it wasn't somebody being nice. It was because of some very wrong things that occurred in our history, and we have to acknowledge those, and we have to understand them in order for us to go that next step of getting somewhere and dealing with this in a meaningful way.
Well, I think that it's a huge opportunity for us to get our stories out. And here in Akam, we've been hosting the Truth and Reconciliation Walk. And every year that we've had it, we see more and more people coming out from the surrounding area, non-First Nation, non-Indigenous peoples coming and joining us. And so we know that it's having an impact to that extent in terms of the word is getting out. People want to know more about what happened and what can we do to work together to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And people that come and join us are, they're compassionate, they're eager to learn, and they just want to be able to do something. Sometimes I think people don't really know what to do when the buzzword of reconciliation is being thrown around. And so to be able to just go on a walk sometimes really helps people when they don't know what to do. Just come out and show your support, and that's what they've been doing. So it means a lot to us when we see a lot of our neighbors that are coming and wanting to join that walk. It really does make us feel like we're seen, we're heard, and that they care.
It's a time, it's a day where we are given the space to reflect. I think for myself, as where I come from, being born and raised living on the reserve and living through the atrocities of the impacts of residential school on our people and the harm that it's done. It's a day to reflect that yes, it happened, but we're resilient, we're stronger together. We have the and hold the answers and I guess the mechanisms to heal in a good way, to not just survive anymore, but to actually thrive. So it's a day to honor our ancestors, honor those that had to endure what they did, those that didn't get to come home. But it's also an opportunity, and I think a duty as a leader is to not let it become just a day. It's a life. It's who we are. And so that day we have the opportunity to educate the non-Indigenous. We have the opportunity to bring to light and bring to surface true, meaningful connection through that truth. And it gives the opposite reciprocating end the opportunity to find the human in them, find the heart in them, to gain a full perspective and understanding, to then look at steps forward of how they become a part of the change, how they become a part of the implementation of the 94 calls to action. What is their role? What is their everyday life role? And sometimes it is just educating your neighbor or educating your parents. Those pieces are true action behind the change that needs to occur in order for those to come to light.
It's certainly an opportunity for us to, to be able to talk about some of the things that I've referenced earlier, some of the uncomfortable truths, that we do need to address. And I think it's an opportunity for us to celebrate who we are and the fact that we are still here. We still exist despite all of the things that have taken place in our history that were set out to eliminate us, that were set out to make us go away because we were an annoyance, we were a nuisance, we were troublesome, we were in the way. I mean, so here we have an opportunity to find ways to have that conversation in a way that hopefully doesn't turn people away, and recognize that we can talk about these things, and we can begin to getting to the place of turning the page. But we're not going to do that until we acknowledge and recognize that truth and reconciliation came about as a result of some very wrong-headed notions in this country.
Well, the only ones that I'm really keeping my eye on are the ones that are related to the reconciliation efforts. So, for example, there's a recommendation about creating the National Commission. And I believe it was Minister Bennett who was the one who was responsible for that. It was in her mandate letter when she was the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. It was in her mandate letter that she was to establish this National Commission. And then there was an election, and like all elections, things get thrown around and you get new faces and new people that come into power. And since then, I don't see that National Commission in anybody's mandate anymore. So, it just makes me wonder. Well, it doesn't make me wonder. It makes me think. It makes me believe that those commitments that were made in the recommendations are just not important enough to follow through on. But that's just one example of one of the recommendations that I want. The other one is about repudiating all those colonial pieces of legislation. Like, we really definitely want to get rid of the Indian Act, right? But we also need to work towards what is going to replace that. Federal and provincial governments need to be supporting First Nations in terms of being able to whether they want to negotiate a modern treaty or whether they want a reconciliation agreement of sorts, but something needs to come in to replace that. And it needs to be able to allow for the First Nation to have authority and jurisdiction to be able to make their own laws. It needs to include, an expanded land base and all of those things. So we need to see more effort on that part. Here in British Columbia, I think we've only seen 5 modern treaties since the inception of the BC treaty process back in 1991. And so some nations have been sitting at tables for over 30 years trying to conclude treaty negotiations with Canada and BC. We'll probably see a few more that are going to become finalized in the next couple of years. But it really is a disappointment to see that of all of the nations that participated in that process, we're only looking at maybe 5 or 6 negotiations at the end of the day, and millions of dollars have been spent. So one of the things in these recommendations talks about doing away with terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery. Now we know that Pope, when he was in Edmonton area, I believe, when he came a couple summers ago, he said that he repudiated that. But it didn't go far enough to actually do away with it. He apologized, he made an apology, but there's other things that need to happen, that need to take place for it to totally be gone. And we're not there yet. So that's one of the recommendations about repudiating the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. Still waiting for that. There's also about negotiating agreements, which I spoke to a little bit more. We need resourcing in order for that to happen. And Canada and British Columbia just don't have the capacity that's needed in order to negotiate these type of reconciliation agreements or modern treaties, whatever you want to call it. They just don't have the capacity to do that. That's one of the main causes for why negotiations are so slow at the tables that currently exist here in BC. So what we really need to see is there needs to be a real commitment and the political will to do these things. And from what I'm observing, it's more of talking outside of your neck and just doing things like not even really putting much of a effort into working towards the recommendations, and more importantly, working towards trying to establish strong relationships with First Nations. The first 5 recommendations are specific to children and families, and that's something that's also near and dear to me. That used to be my portfolio when I was at the provincial tables, was working with Canada and British Columbia to try to create the space for nations to take over that jurisdictional space when it comes to children and families in First Nation communities. So we were fortunate enough to work towards getting the C-92 legislation in place that allows for nations to be able to draw down jurisdiction if they so choose. And that was one of the recommendations in the TRC. The other recommendations, I don't see much movement happening there. For example, it talked about fully implementing Jordan's Principle. And Jordan's Principle is a resource that many First Nation communities rely on to help with programs and supports for those kids that are at risk and who have maybe some special needs that they need supports with. And the federal government right now is really dragging their heels in terms of trying to get that off the ground. It's just become a huge mess. Here in British Columbia, I believe that there's 44,000 backlog applications for Jordan's Principle. And so those are 44,000 children that are not receiving the resourcing and the supports that they need just to be able to have a regular day, right? They're struggling right now. And so, we continue to put the pressure on the on the federal government to just let First Nations be the ones to manage those resources. Why do we have to have it managed through the Indigenous Services Canada department when it's just such a huge bureaucracy, and anything that goes through there oftentimes gets stalled or it gets missed, right? I sent in a recommendation or a request for follow-up to the regional director, who's Alison Rowe for British Columbia, last summer. She just responded. And I was asking about why are we not covering costs, or why are we not being reimbursed or having some resources approved for a child who wanted to participate in cultural activities, right? They denied those costs associated with the elder support and the drum group and whatever else was part of that. And this is what Jordan's Principle, some of it, that's what it's for, is that cultural connection, so that we can make sure kids know who they are and where they come from. Because when kids know that, statistics and studies show that they thrive from knowing who they are. But when you're being denied that because, Indigenous Services Canada doesn't fully agree with you, who are they to make that determination, right? So that's one of the recommendations that's in the TRC that's not seeing any traction either. And, I know that we're only talking about 94 recommendations. It shouldn't be that hard, especially if you have really strong working relationships with the First Nations people in this country. And we have been trying to do that for decades, trying to create that space, trying to bring Canada and British Columbia along with us. When you think about the calls to justice, though, that's 231 calls to justice. Since that report and those recommendations came out in 2021, only 2 of those recommendations have been implemented. And that's really sad, because those recommendations are speaking specifically to murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and what needs to be done to try to prevent that from continuing to happen in this country. So there is no political will, in my view. The catchphrase reconciliation has lost its attraction for Canada and British Columbia, and they're just going to focus on something else. But I'm going to tell them that they need to be reminded that they've had it quite easy. It's easy working with us, and we're going to, we can be cooperative with each other as long as we're making strides towards achieving things. But if you're just going to try to ignore us, then you're going to be having yourself back in court again, right? You're going to have protesting. You're going to have blockades. And if that's what you want, then that's what you're going to get, because First Nations people in this country are not prepared to go back. We're not going back 10, 20 years. We are going to continue to move forward with or without them. And if it means needing to drag them kicking and screaming, then so be it. But I think that they have enough history amongst them that they should know that it's always easier to work with people than it is to try to work around us and get around us. But we have constitutionally protected rights. And there has been numerous Supreme Court rulings over the decades that have ruled in the favor of the First Nation about the recognition of our rights and recognition of our title. And so, they can't forget that, and we're never going to forget that.
I guess it would be all of the language and culture 13, so calls to action 13 to 17, specifically around language and culture and the right to learn our language, the right to speak our language, the right to teach our language. We have those rights, but we also have a responsibility. We know that, to learn, to continue to keep our languages alive. But it needs to be one of the biggest issues as a leader that I have right now is how the federal funding regime works towards language. Our language, the Ktunaxa language, is a language isolate. It is so unique that there is no other language like it in the world. And there's a true spiritual connection to that. And our language is tied directly to our land. It was given to us just like we were derived from our land. And that's our connect. That's how we communicate. That's how we gain our perspective, understanding our obligations, our duties. And without the proper respect and implementation of that, we lose a part of ourselves. And that's, again, another form of genocide. And we can't allow colonial systems to continue to erode who we are and our importance. And instead, those calls to actions are calling upon the government to implement systems and process, policy and understanding in a way that is going to uphold that. And that's not being done. It's, we have a tendency to live in a world right now where everything has to be at such a speed and one size fits all, right? Break it down into provinces. BC alone, we have 3 isolate languages. None of the other provinces have that uniqueness, but yet we are continued to be pulled in with everything else, where it loses that true meaning. It loses its essence of what it is and its uniqueness. And then we have to fit molds. And that's not how our language works. That's not how our culture works. That's not how our spirituality works. And when the colonial systems can understand and have enough trust in let us lead the way, specifically in matters of who we are, they will actually see the change and the truancy that they need to make better decisions that, again, will result in that true collaboration, and beautiful things will come from it, where we're in a society today where we all need to work together for the greater good. We all need to pitch in for a better future for our future generations. And I think that that's a really important perspective or understanding, that people that have decision-making authority and power need to really take into consideration, and they need to put us at those decision-making tables. The other call to action is so call to action 92 around, and they call it business and reconciliation, I believe. But the really key pieces in there are having the First Nations have the authority, the autonomy, and the right for free, prior, informed consent, the right to be, we're not just stakeholders, we are decision makers. We have the authority, and we have a huge responsibility. And I think that that's the key piece that a lot of colonial systems don't understand. Is you hear a lot about rights and title or recognition. So they fall into, well, let's give them, let's recognize that they have these things, and let's recognize them by giving them opportunity to provide input, right? That whole consultative piece of it. Let's consult with them. Then we can say the First Nations had a piece in this. They're the ones that put forward this information. But again, it's not deep enough. It's still that superficial layer piece where, no, put us at the decision-making table at the appropriate level. Because also, again, I think that we're at a place in time right now where we can't all be painted with the same paintbrush. Our uniqueness in our languages, in our ceremony, in who we are, needs to be at the forefront. It's integral to move forward in a good way for us to be able to ensure that we're doing our due diligence with our responsibility piece. And that's specific when it comes to lands and resources. We have an inherent responsibility to take care of the lands, the waters, all living things. We also have laws it doesn't matter what First Nation or groups of Indigenous peoples and where they come from, we have laws. Our Aqnumut Stichlich, which is our natural law, is unwritten. They are laws that have been here since time immemorial, thousands and thousands of years, that have never changed, where our colonial systems and practice is change laws or create laws to move something forward, to gain access, to change responsibility. We don't have the authority and autonomy to do that, because those laws were gifted to us to uphold as being humans on the lands that we come from. And those laws need to be the foundation of all that we do. And that's within our creation story. That's our constitution. Those are our covenants with Creator, to see those through. And the more opportunity we can have to authentically show up and authentically bring forward who we are as a Ktunaxa for Yaqut Aknukliat First Nation, the more opportunities there are going to be for true transparency, collaboration, and insight into the future of all mankind, all humans that live within our traditional territory. It's not just for us that we're doing it, it's for everybody and everything. But we need to be given the decision-making authority that we deserve, and we need to be given the space to honor our rights and responsibilities just as much as the rights and responsibilities as the provincial and federal systems uphold.
Well, I think the one that I constantly speak about anytime that I have the opportunity is the one regarding the education system, because I think about the education system providing the opportunity for people from a very young age to learn the real truth and to be able to grow up with that. When I think about myself, I attended the public school system, and the kinds of things that that I was subject to, and as a result, the people that I went to school with were subject to. I mean, obviously, as a child, I didn't question them, but now as an adult, I think some of those things that we were taught were so wrong. They were so wrong in so many ways, and so I think the fact that there was such emphasis on the education system, to me, is an extremely important thing, particularly when you think about the emphasis on making sure that the teachers are taught differently. Because in order for the education system to actually be revamped, the people that are responsible for the delivery of the education need to make sure that they're provided with the tools and the information that will allow them to be able to tell a different story, so that the small person that is starting their learning, their structured learning in the education system will be given some of the truths that I've been talking about, that those truths will then grow with them, and they bring that into their lives as they become adults. Because it's really concerning to me that some of the things that I hear from people today that are younger than me, and they're racist, they're wrong-headed, and all of these things, and people are saying these things, and I'm thinking, what's wrong with this picture? These are people that that should have been learning something different, but they haven't been. And so we need to revamp this system that is teaching wrong things about the foundation of this country. You know, the fact that it's built on the notion of terra nullius, which was an empty land, or the doctrine of discovery, you know, which meant that these folks came along and they discovered this place as though it was empty land. All of that is wrong, you know. And then we have the creation of Canada based on the fact that initially it started out that there was going to be sort of even kind of our opportunity to have conversation on a more or less balanced basis. But as time went by, that you ended up having people suggesting then that the folks that were here, you know, the Indigenous people, were less than, you know. So as a consequence, all of the things that, you know, that have led to the building and led to the creation of the things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission became part of everyday life. And, you know, and there we went as a country. We started going down.
How important do you think it is, specifically on the education side of things, that these things are taught to children at a very young age? Because I know that the younger kids are the more kind of formative their brains are. And do you think it's even more important to get that information out to them from a very young age?
Oh, very much so. Because, I mean, we're talking about truth here. You know, the education system is designed to provide tools to young people to grow into good adults. And that's not going to happen if they're not provided with truthful information. And, you know, if we indeed are going to change the narrative in this country, and that's something that, you know, that I think is extremely important. If anything is going to, it can't be just one or two things. It has to be a huge, you know, it has to be a shift. And, you know, that's going to take a lot of work. And we've been working on this for how long now? And, you know, how much have we moved things? Not very much. You know, so I think that, you know, unless we deal with people from a very young age who it becomes instilled in them, and it's, you know, and it's not, you know, we're not telling them, we're not programming them, we're just providing truth. And that truth then grows with them into adulthood.
It's really important to understand that the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, those are opportunities to really gain perspective and understanding, to uphold what is all happening right now. And sometimes that is just being accountable. Because when you show up and you're accountable, you're transparent, we can move forward. We can leave that where it is and move forward in a better way to, again, achieve the outcomes that we're all looking for, especially when it comes to our environment and the healing of our people and society as a whole, and climate change. Those are all global impacted issues and concerns that it doesn't matter what your cultural background is or what the color of your skin is. Those will impact everybody equally. But there's always time, and there needs to be given the true space to honor our laws, honor our decision-making authority, and trust that what we're bringing forward is true collaboration, true reconciliation to positively impact all living things, including humans, together.
One of the things that I like to say to groups of people, and I speak to, you know, different groups of folks, you know, for In fact, I'll just use an example. Yesterday, I spoke to the steel workers who were meeting out at St. Eugene. And one of the things that I say to groups is to issue an individual challenge, to each person to say, what is it that you can do? Because, you look at the calls to action and people get overwhelmed. You look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and you go, oh my God, that's just way too big. That's just way too much. But then what I ask people to do is look at them and then find the one thing that resonates with you so that you can begin to make a shift in your life, that you can do something that you're going to do differently in terms of how you behave and how you teach your kids and et cetera, so that means that individual action is what we talked about at the very beginning. How is this going to happen? It's going to have to happen person by person, and those people need to take that personal responsibility of, first of all, accepting that there's something wrong. That's why we had to have a commission, and accepting that they've contributed to it, even though they may think they haven't. But when you start thinking about how people behave from their point of privilege, and all of the things that have occurred as a result of the wrong-headed notions that I referred to of the empty land and all of that. Talk about the land. People talk about their land. And I'm thinking, and in this area, it's right in the middle of our homeland. And, what do we have? We have postage stamp pieces of reserve land that we don't even own, but really when you come down to it, nobody owns land anyway, because guess what? You can't take it with you, but it's just a matter of people trying to make that effort, I guess, and whatever that effort is for themselves, I encourage people to do that, because a lot of times that I find that people would prefer that Indigenous people are frozen in time, that they are the stereotypical notion of the picture that's been drawn over the years, and that people aren't acknowledging that as society is evolving, so are we, that we don't have to be only brought out to dance and drum, and I say that because, a lot of times that's what people think about. They don't acknowledge the fact that we've got emerging artists, we've got emerging business people, we've got businesses that are thriving, and we're doing things, and that we're good neighbors, and we're willing to coexist on Ktunaxa. And we just hope that people would acknowledge and recognize that too, that the place that they've chosen to be their home was our home long before anybody came along, and acknowledge that. And I'll say that because a lot of times we hear the land acknowledgements at, whatever event, but unless people think about it and it's meaningful to them, don't bother, Don't talk about being on somebody's homeland if you don't mean it. If you're only saying it, because, somebody told you to say it, and that's what I mean by, in order for us to make, to really be making progress, that personal responsibility comes into play.